I knew something was wrong the second I saw the smile on Nolan Reese's face during the company-wide video call, because it was the kind of smile guys where when they think they already won, he had just finished another jargon-heavy speech about modernization and future velocity, while more than 1,000 employees watched in silent squares on screen right. Before opening questions, he leaned toward the camera like he was admiring himself, and said, "We are finally letting go of outdated systems and evolving." I had spent nearly 15 years building the system he just called outdated. 15 years keeping Oravex solutions from collapsing every time leadership chased a new trend without understanding the foundation. I was not some leftover engineer from the old days. I was the reason our transition into automated infrastructure did not destroy the company. I wrote the modular backbone that powered security access, credential validation, audit, tracking, and encrypted workflows across multiple divisions. It was my architecture that held everything together quietly, efficiently, without applause. Nolan had been with the company less than a year. He arrived with polished slides, buzzwords, and the confidence of someone who had never stayed long enough to clean up his own mistakes. He talked about replacing my system like it was an inconvenience instead of the spine of the company. He never once asked how it worked or why certain limits existed. The system had a name, PulseFrame, and I designed it myself, not open source, not vendor dependent, and legally protected. When leadership approved it years earlier, I added a licensing clause that everyone signed without reading because they trusted me, or more likely assumed I would never leave. The clause stated that upon my voluntary resignation, all system dependencies would automatically revert to neutral ownership unless a custodial agreement was renewed before. And no one ever asked what that meant. They smiled, nodded, and moved on. I watched them ignore it the same way they ignored the night hours, the emergency fixes, and the silent saves. Every time a new engineering hire broke something, I repaired it without fanfare from my old desk with a keyboard worn smooth from use. I never complained. I just kept things stable. When Nolan skipped my emails about renewing the custodial agreement, I did not get emotional. I got methodical. I sent a formal notice to him and the chief technology officer, warning that the renewal window was closing. I attached documentation, legal approval, and audit records. There was no reply. Human resources reached out instead, asking if I planned to stay another year. I did not answer. I went back into the contract, reviewed the clause, added timestamps, archived everything, and documented the silence. I did not want conflict. I wanted proof. Nolan continued acting like the system belonged to him, like I was just another background employee. He did not realize he was standing on a fuse. The system did not need me to flip a switch. It was already designed to respond to one thing, only my departure. The quarterly meeting arrived bloated and performative. Nolan loved the spotlight. I waited through the noise until the live questions began. I raised my hand calmly and asked what the plan was for PulseFrame custodian. Shit. After the upcoming deadline, Nolan laughed, mocked the system, and called it obsolete. A few people laughed with him. I stayed calm, smiled, and said understood. Then I resigned, effective immediately, on record in front of everyone, and left the call. And as my screen went dark, the countdown they ignored finally reached 0. And what happened next was something none of them were prepared to face. It took less than 2 hours for the first warning to surface. While Nolan was probably still enjoying the echo of his own voice from the meeting, the monitoring system flagged irregular behavior inside PulseFrame. Not an error, not a crash, just a quiet shift in status, like a lock turning without sound. A junior engineer posted in Slack asking If anyone else saw the dependency reversion notice, most ignored it, assuming it was another false alarm. Within minutes, access requests across finance operations and development began timing out. No passwords failed. They simply stopped being recognized. Two-factor authentication never triggered. Audit trails vanished, not erased, but sealed behind encryption that no one could unlock. Legal could not verify access. History compliance teams lost visibility. Internal authentication layer stopped responding without throwing a single error message. Doors that relied on synced credentials refused to open. Remote employees were trapped in endless reauthorization loops. API returned null values like the system itself had decided not to answer anymore. Panic did not arrive loudly. It crept in when Slack went silent, when emails stacked up unanswered, when leadership realized they could not even identify who was logged in anymore. The engineers tore through the codebase, desperate for a backdoor, but there was none. Every key was bound to an authority that no longer existed. My resignation timestamp had triggered conditional locks written years earlier. They called it a cascading failure. I called it arithmetic, because it was always going to end this way. When legal finally pulled the licensing archive, they found the clause exactly where I said it was. Highlighted, signed, dated, and approved by executives who now claimed they did not remember it. The language was airtight, automatic, non-reversible upon voluntary resignation, unless custodial agreement renewed prior to departure. It listed every dependent system and every security layer now asleep. There was no vendor override because there was no vendor, only me. The chief technology officer went pale when he realized even he had no root access. Left the realization hit all at once. They had not lost the system through sabotage. They had surrendered it years ago by assuming I would never leave. They assembled an emergency response group, lawyers, engineers, consultants, all speaking different languages of panic. But none of them could change what was written. The system was not broken. It was obeying exactly as designed. That night, the general counsel replayed the meeting recording, watching Nolan dismiss the system and call it trash, watching me smile and resign, watching the silence. After he opened the contract, reread the clause, checked signatures, metadata, everything intact. He drafted an email labeled reinstatement proposal urgent and ordered his team to prepare terms without limits at dawn. I received it while making coffee. The document offered money, retroactive compensation, a new custodial agreement at triple my rate, and a public statement acknowledging my foundational role. I read it slowly, then sent it to my attorney. His response went out hours later. Client declines reinstatement. Clause remains active. All support withdrawn. There was nothing else to say. The board met in private days later, staring at slides showing 80% lock out, 0 day, a loss, 0 access. The general counsel delivered the final truth calmly. Your CEO called the system obsolete. Now we cannot even log in. No one defended. Nolan's silence settled heavy and final. Weeks passed. Then a letter arrived with a screenshot of my resignation moment and a handwritten note offering even more money. I placed it in a drawer and walked away completely, because some systems are not built to be reclaimed. They are built to remember, and what they remembered was about to change everything for them. The company tried to survive without pulse frame, and that was when the real damage began. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just slow, expensive suffocation. Teams were told to use cached credentials and local workarounds. Security Policies were loosened quietly to keep basic operations running, which meant compliance. Deadlines started blinking, red across internal dashboards. Finance could not reconcile access history's product teams could not push updates without bypassing safeguards that once protected them. Vendors demanded verification that no one could provide. Clients started noticing delays log out strange behavior. Nobody could explain. Leadership called it an internal realignment, but engineers knew better because they were rebuilding a skeleton with no blueprint. Nolan vanished from public view. Not fired, not defended, just absent. The board avoided saying my name like it was a bad luck charm. Recruiters were called consultants, flown in, all of them promising miracles with diagrams and confidence. None of them understood the architecture because PulseFrame was not a product you could replace. It was philosophy baked into how the company trusted itself. They tried stitching together third-party tools, identity managers, cloud plugins, emergency access layers, and every fix created 3 new problems. Logs did not align, permissions conflicted, odd reports failed silently. The more they added, the worse. It became like piling furniture against a door that was never meant to open. Inward mean. While my phone stayed quiet, no messages, no threats, no apologies, just the sound of distance settling in. I took contract work elsewhere, small teams who asked questions before touching things, who listened when I explained why boundaries mattered. I slept better knowing nothing I built was being insulted in meetings. The news broke quietly one morning. Oravex Solutions experienced a multi-day operational outage impacting client access across regions. Stocks dipped, not crashed, but enough for analysts to notice. Rumors spread about internal chaos, departures, emergency spending. The same engineers who once laughed reached out, asking for advice, not ownership, just hints. I ignored them because guidance without authority is just liability. Weeks later, an internal memo leaked. Nolan resigned, citing personal reasons. No farewell, no thank you, no acknowledgement of what he broke. The board appointed an interim leader who spoke about humility and lessons learned. But it was too late. The trust layer was gone. Clients moved, contracts paused, integrations, compliance agencies requested audits, the kind you cannot rush. The system had not failed them, it had exposed them. The final report never mentioned my name directly, but everyone knew it. Called the incident a governance oversight, a failure to respect custodial dependency architecture, a sanitized way of saying they spoke over the architect and paid for it. I received one last message months later from the General Counsel. Not an offer, not a plea, just a statement. We understand now. I never replied. Understanding after loss is just regret in a suit. I archived the message and shut the laptop. PulseFrame remained sealed, untouched, doing exactly what it was meant to do. Protect itself. When respect vanished, I did not celebrate. I did not gloat. I moved on, because the point was never revenge, it was boundaries. And somewhere inside a quiet, locked system sat a lesson they would never forget about what happens when you mistake silence for weakness. And the final consequence was still coming. By the 4th month, the company was bleeding in ways no press release could hide. Contracts expired without renewal. Support queues doubled. Engineering attrition spiked because no one wants to stay where systems feel haunted. Meetings became shorter, quieter, stripped of confidence. The interim leadership talked about rebuilding trust, but trust is not a patch you deploy. It is earned slowly and lost instantly. They tried recreating PulseFrame from documentation scraps, but documentation only shows what a system does not, why it refuses certain things. The consultant rebuilt something that functioned on paper but failed under pressure. Security incidents began appearing small at first, then larger, each one traced back to missing guardrails that had once existed unnoticed. The irony was painful. Pulse frame had prevented these failures for years without praise, and now its absence was loud. Nolan was never blamed publicly, but internally his name became shorthand for arrogance. Junior engineers were warned quietly not to dismiss legacy systems without understanding them. The board commissioned a governance overhaul, new rules, new approvals, new checks, all designed to prevent another me from walking away with the keys, but it was too late because the keys were never taken. They were surrendered. I watched from a distance, occasionally reading updates forwarded by friends. Still inside, the company survived barely, but smaller, diminished, cautious innovation slowed. Because fear replaced confidence, every new system required legal review, custodial planning, redundancy, mapping, things I had tried to teach years earlier and been ignored. The cost of learning late is always higher. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt closure. The system did exactly what I designed it do, and so did I. One afternoon, I received an anonymous package. Inside was a printed slide from the board meeting, the one that read proprietary core owner, resigned, written in plain text, like a confession on the back. Someone had written, "We should have listened." I folded it and placed it in a box. Old notebooks and retired hardware, reminders of work done right. The company never asked again, and I never offered. Some lessons cannot be taught, only experienced. When architecture is ignored, it waits. When respect disappears, it withdraws quietly. And when the architect leaves, the system remembers. It was built for the silence that followed was the final design, and the story did not end there. A year after everything collapsed, I ran into one of the old engineers at a conference in Denver. Not planned, not dramatic, just two people recognizing a shared ghost. He looked older, thinner, like someone who had been carrying weight without rest. We talked about neutral things, weather, travel, bad hotel coffee, until he finally mentioned the company without saying its name. He said they were still rebuilding, still afraid of touching anything too central, too powerful. Every major decision now went through layers of approval because no one wanted to be responsible for another silent failure. The irony stayed sharp. They chased speed and lost years. He asked if I ever regretted leaving. I told him no, because regret only comes when you abandon something unfinished. Pulse frame was finished. The lesson was not. He nodded like someone hearing confirmation of a truth he already knew. He told me the company now teaches new hires about custodial architecture. During onboarding, they do not mention me directly, but they describe the incident like a cautionary tale about ownership, respect, and invisible labor. He said Nolan's name is never used, but everyone knows he thanked me not for the system, but for the boundary. That word stayed with me. Boundary systems have them, people need them too. I went home after the conference and thought about how many engineers burn out because they confuse loyalty with silence. They think being needed means being valued. It does not. Being needed just means you are convenient until you are not. Pulse frame was never about control. It was about clarity, about knowing exactly who held responsibility and what happened when that responsibility was dismissed. The company learned that lesson the hard way. I learned something too, that walking away can be an act of design, not failure. I started mentoring younger engineers, teaching them how to protect their work without becoming bitter, how to document, how to insist, how to write clauses that speak when you no longer can. Some listened. Some thought I was paranoid. I smiled and let them learn in their own time. A few months later, I received another message, this time from someone new at the company, asking for advice on rebuilding trust layers. I replied, politely declined involvement, and offered one sentence of guidance: respect. Architect, before you need them. That was all they never wrote back, and that was fine, because the story was never about revenge or victory. It was about permanence. The system slept exactly as intended, unreachable, intact, a quiet reminder that architecture outlives ego, and somewhere inside a boardroom, a slide still existed that read owner resigned like a warning label they could not peel off. The company moved forward, but slower, smaller, more careful, and I moved on, completely building things that knew when to stop. And the final part of this story was still waiting. The last time I heard about arrogance was not through news or rumor, but through silence, the kind that tells you a story already ended quietly. The company still existed, still operated, still claimed progress. But it no longer led anything. It followed, cautiously, watching others take risks it once would have chased recklessly. People inside had learned to fear the unseen layers, the parts of systems that do not announce themselves until they are gone. Pulseframe became internal folklore, a ghost system referenced in training materials and compliance decks, a reminder that ownership is not just legal language, but responsibility. I never returned to that industry circle fully. I built smaller, sharper systems for teams who asked the right questions and treated architecture like trust, not leverage. Sometimes younger engineers asked me why I always insisted on exit conditions, fail safes, and custodial clarity. I told them because every system needs to know what to do when its creator is no longer there, and so does every person. Loyalty without respect is just a slow erasure. Walking away taught me that power does not always roar. Sometimes it disengages calmly and leaves everyone else to confront the consequences. I kept the last encrypted checksum of Pulseframe stored away, not because I planned to use it, but because proof matters in a world that forgets quickly. Years later, someone tried to claim the system had never existed, that the outage was exaggerated. I did not respond publicly. I sent one file through a lawyer, and the conversation ended immediately. Some things do not need defending if they were built correctly. I never spoke Nolan's name again, not out of spite, but because he stopped mattering. The damage was done by culture, not one man. He was just the loudest symptom. The real failure was assuming that the quiet builder would always stay. The system mirrored that truth perfectly. When respect left, it folded inward, not in anger, not in revenge, but in alignment with its rules. The same way I did not burn bridges. I simply stopped standing on them. The world rewards noise, but it runs on silence, and those who build that silence deserve more than applause. They deserve agency. Pulseframe was not my greatest achievement. Walking away was, and the story ends not with collapse or triumph, but with understanding. Some systems are not meant to be recovered, some exits are final, and some lessons only surface after the architect is gone.